Welcome to this Renew Review. My name is John Whitaker, and in addition to doing projects like this for Renew, I'm also the creator of what's known as the Listener's Commentary on the Old and New Testaments. And what I do in the Listener's Commentary is I provide clear, down-to-earth teaching straight through the books of the Bible in order to help people learn and live the Bible. In this review, we are going to be looking at a new book by maybe a surprising author. It's a book called The Greatest Story Ever Told, and it is by Bear Grylls. And there's a good chance that when you hear the name Bear Grylls, you don't automatically think of books about the Bible. Bear Grylls, if you're familiar with the name, became somewhat of a household name through TV shows like Man vs. Wild and various spin-offs of that. In other words, Bear Grylls is known for his TV shows and even books about adventuring and survival techniques and all the things related to that. What's surprising is that Bear Grylls is actually the author of 100 different books, but all of them in some form or fashion have to do with survival, adventure, or motivational speaking from survival and adventure. So this book, The Greatest Story, is really a new kind of breaking new ground for Bear Grylls. And the reality is, Bear Grylls actually has a very active faith in Jesus, and that's a central part to his life. This book grows out of that. In fact, in an interview for Premier Christianity about this book, he had this to say. He said, "I'm proud of my other books, and I don't want to belittle them. But this is different. It's the proudest thing in my work life that I've ever done." In a nutshell, what this book is it's a retelling of the story of Jesus from a first-person perspective. When I was working on my doctorate with Haddon Robinson, he required us to read books about preaching first-person narrative sermons, and then he required us to actually preach a first-person narrative sermon. Felt a little bit more like theater to me, definitely out of my comfort zone, but it had to be done. So I preached a sermon from a first-person perspective on Samson for the chapel at the Bible college where I was teaching at the time. And I was actually amazed at the amount of exegetical work that I had to put into that sermon. And then I was stunned by the impact that first-person sermon had on the students in chapel. So with that experience in mind, I overcame my inhibitions and I decided to preach another first-person sermon, this time on Easter Sunday. And I'll never forget the lady who came up to me after service, caught me, and said, man, she had kind of been dreading going to church on that Easter Sunday, assuming it'll just be another Easter sermon. And then she said, but the first-person perspective was so moving and so compelling that it created a unique Easter experience for her. All of that to say, I really appreciate what Bear Grylls is attempting to do in this particular book, The Greatest Story Ever Told. So let me just offer a quick summary of the book. What Grylls does is he uses the Gospel of John as sort of like the backbone to the book, and then he provides a harmony of the Gospel from the perspective of various characters who were there. In fact, the book is broken into 5 different parts. And while the book doesn't cover every story in the Gospels, I think Grylls does a good job synthesizing the majority of the Gospel stories into a harmonized whole. The chapters are short, and the story moves along at an engaging pace. And what it does is it takes the life of Jesus in 5 parts from the perspective of 5 different people. So part 1 comes from Mary's perspective, which makes sense. And it traces her experience from the angelic announcement of her pregnancy to the events surrounding Jesus' birth. And her perspective continues right up to Jesus being left in Jerusalem when he was 12 years old, and then all the way up to his baptism by John the Baptist. Part 2 then shares some of Jesus' early ministry from the perspective of Thomas. And it picks up at the wedding in Cana. And this section includes such well-known stories as the cleansing of the temple, the woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, the calming of the storm on the Sea of Galilee, and several other, all as Thomas wrestles with who Jesus really is. Part 3 continues the story from Simon Peter's outlook, and it includes various gospel stories where Peter is the central player. So it visualized Peter's perspective on events such as the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, the conversation at Caesarea Philippi. And this section concludes just before the final week when Jesus enters into Jerusalem before the crucifixion. So part 4 opens up at the triumphal entry, and Jesus is going into Jerusalem, and it concludes with Jesus' death on the cross. And it recounts Jesus' final week from John's vantage point, highlighting key moments from Jesus' interaction with the temple authorities and the upper room discourse with the disciples before narrating the account of the crucifixion from John's perspective. And then finally, part 5 of the book focuses on the resurrection and does so through the eyes of Mary Magdalene. She retells her own experience of discovering the empty tomb, meeting the resurrected Jesus. She shares what it was like to be with him and see him in the upper room after the resurrection, and to be there later along the shores of the Sea of Galilee when Jesus restores Peter. And finally, Mary Magdalene gives her account of the ascension of Jesus 40 days after the resurrection. So, what's valuable about this book? Well, the great benefit of a first-person approach like this is how it brings the story to life. And Grylls is really a good storyteller, so this approach knocks the dust off familiar gospel stories and really provides a fresh experience of the life of Jesus. Now, I think you need to be aware as you're reading a book like this that composing a first-person narrative, whether for a book like this or in a sermon, it always involves making a number of interpretive decisions and taking some creative license. So there's going to be some places in this book where I would have seen some things differently. I would have visualized the scene maybe a little bit differently than Grylls does. But I appreciate the fact that Grylls doesn't over-dramatize the story and add too many additional details, take too much creative license. He actually shows good restraint by simply retelling the story from a different angle. And he allows that change of angle then to do the work of helping us experience the story of Jesus in a fresh new way. When done well like that, seeing Bible stories through the eyes of various characters who were there actually lends fresh insights into the story and involves your own self and your emotions in a way that a third-person narrative does not. Now, I do have a few suggestions for the book. If I could have consulted with Bear Grylls on it, I would have suggested just a handful of things. First, when it comes to people's names and even place names, Grylls chooses to use Hebrew versions of their names or place names written in English. He's not consistent with that, but for example, Mary is Miriam, and Thomas is Taom, and Jerusalem is Jerusalem, and so on. And I understand that Grylls was trying to add a layer of authenticity to the story by doing this. I just felt like it was more confusing than helpful. So I would have suggested just sticking with the familiar names, which would have made the story much more clear. Another suggestion I would have made for Grylls is I think it would have been helpful to add some scripture references to where these stories come from, maybe as like a little subhead for the chapter, maybe down in a footnote, but some way to alert readers to where these stories are deriving from in the Gospels themselves. Because if Grylls is hoping this book is sort of like an introduction to people who are less familiar with the Bible, well, having those scripture references then can allow this book to be a gateway to reading the Bible itself. Unfortunately, there's none of that, and so it's not always clear if you're not familiar with the Gospels where these stories are coming from. And then finally, I would have loved to seen at least some of these stories told with a little bit more theological freight so that the original author's theological intent in the gospel stories would have come through in this first-person version of it. I get that that's not Grylls' strength. He's not a theologian after all or a biblical scholar. And he did include a few moments where maybe some key insights like that came through. But overall, I think Grylls left that out. And I just think one of the real strengths as well as challenges of a first-person account like this is stepping into the world of the original character and thinking what he or she thinks so that you don't merely retell the story, but you relive the story. For example, in the telling of the calming of the storm, Grylls does note that this alerted the gospel disciples to the idea that, man, maybe this guy is more than just a man. Maybe he's God. But it would have been helpful to actually tell that portion and bring us to see that insight or that thought from the perspective of a first century Jewish person like Thomas would have been and the disciples were. To have them think through maybe out loud, like, I know the Psalms, and I know that the only one who can calm storms like this is the Creator himself. Things like that bring the story to life. They don't add a whole lot of extra unnecessary details, but they help us see and feel what the gospel writer was intending in the telling of the story. And when first-person narrative is done well like that within the confines of the original theological message of the story, I have found that it can actually deliver the theological freight of the text extremely well. Overall, however, I was extremely impressed by this book. I found it a fresh and enjoyable read. Grylls does a great job bringing the story of Jesus to life that helps us maybe see the setting and experience the drama in new ways. And personally, as I was reading through this book, I found myself at times moved by the story. My heart stirred up for admiration and appreciation for Jesus. And so I think this book can be a fun and engaging read to help you maybe experience Jesus and the story of the Gospels in fresh ways, or as a read for somebody who's brand new to the story of Jesus. This can help them experience it in a vivid sort of way that might then become a gateway for exploring the life of Jesus through the Gospels.